This is Kay Halasek coming to you again from Ohio State University and with the introduction of our next video demonstration. Really more of an instructional video here, as what I'm going to be spending my time today doing is talking with you about the work of Joseph Bishop and his article, BEAM, A Rhetorical Vocabulary for Teaching Research-Based Writing. So I'm giving a fairly comprehensive summary analysis, if you will, or summary abstract of the piece. We hope this will be a helpful article for you as you move into the final required assignment, Assignment 4. The article, BEAM, is one that, as you can see from the abstract here, is really intended for writing teachers as an argument for encouraging them, the teachers, to think differently about how they present research to the students in their classes. You can see from the abstract here that what Bishop is suggesting is that we move to a rhetorical perspective on research-based writing, rather than talking simply about primary or secondary sources, which he believes are not particularly useful terms, that rather than use those, that we use instead 4 terms as we talk about research in use, how writers use research in their texts. He presents to us background for materials that a writer relies on for general information or factual evidence, exhibits, that is, using other sources as exhibits for the materials that a writer might analyze or interpret. Argument, for those materials a writer uses in making claims or engaging the topic of conversation. And then finally, method, a use of materials from which the writer takes a governing concept or derives a manner of working. Now I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking very briefly and giving you some examples of each of these. I'll turn first to background. These are, again, those materials that a writer relies on for general information or factual evidence. You'll see on the right-hand side of this slide, then, 3 examples. In fact, these 3 examples come from Bishop's own article. You can see here, for example, that he uses secondary sources, not by citing them, that is, not by quoting from them directly, but by characterizing them. Over the past several decades, he writes, scholars have put forth valuable proposals about researched writing. If you had the whole article here, you would be able to see then that he gives us a kind of summary list, if you will, a kind of cataloging of the different perspectives people have taken, others have focused on. The scholar David Brent similarly holds. So he actually doesn't give specific quotations or too many specific quotations from these scholars, but instead uses the conversation that Bishop is entering as a point of conversation, a point of background. In this case, Bishop is outlining for his readers the turns in the conversations over time about how research has been presented by high school and college teachers to their students. The E in BEAM is exhibit. These are the materials that a writer analyzes or interprets in the course of his or her essay or blog post or opinion piece. So again, think of yourself as a writer undertaking assignment 4. What exhibits will you be using? What will you be analyzing or interpreting? There is a curious symmetry, Bishop writes, about the sources that he's using in his text in the way that writing handbooks introduce the standard terms about research writing. For Bishop, then, the exhibits that he's analyzing and interpreting include college writing handbooks. So those are exhibits. He looks at them as he would, say, a work of art or a piece of sculpture. And so they are the things, the objects that he looks at. And then I have extracted here, again, a couple of quotations from Bishop. He says these handbooks offer thumbnail definitions, that one popular handbook states a particular possession and another asserts. So he's presenting these to us as objects for our consideration. And then he concludes with his own statement, which is the statement on the right in red. While such statements, he's referring back to the ones from the textbooks he's been analyzing, help, they can also be problematic. So you can see he's examined the exhibits, he's analyzed and interpreted them, and from that he then leads into his statement of sort of contestation, his different opinion. Because now we can expect that he's going to go ahead now and talk about what he finds problematic. And then he sets up his own argument regarding BEAM, using background, exhibit, argument, and method as a better way of talking, a more rhetorical way of talking about research. Next, he takes up argument, the A in BEAM. These are the materials whose claims a writer engages. Think about conversation or about debate or argument. Who is it? Which materials do you want to engage? Whose claims do you want to call into question? Whose pieces are going to be points of departure for you as you articulate your position? On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a fairly long quotation from Bissup's article in which he engages the work of Richard Larson. He points out what Larson argues, that because research practices vary so dramatically, that English teachers should stop teaching the research paper altogether, as if it were a universal genre, as if it were something in and of itself. There's no such thing as the research paper outside of an English class. In fact, research in the sciences, in business, in the arts, in the humanities vary so dramatically that we can't think of just one thing as the research paper. This is Larson's argument. That's the argument that Bissup is engaging in his piece. And then you can see here, also highlighted in red, that Bissup then takes Larson's claim and turns it into his own. While I agree with Larson on this point, the wider lesson I take from his article is that writing teachers have a special obligation to teach research-based writing. So he doesn't dismiss Larson entirely, but simply turns his argument, engages that claim as a point of departure for himself as he turns to his own argument about rhetorically based researched writing. Bissup presents to us method. Now this is a term that might be somewhat ambiguous and maybe a bit abstract, more abstract than background, exhibit, and argument. But by method, Bissup means materials from which a writer takes a governing concept or derives a manner of working. Think of this as the approach or the method of using key terms, acquiring or using procedures, models, or perspectives from the work that you might be using. For example, if there are key terms from a critical contributor to the conversation you're joining, you may want to use that key term. So what you're doing is selecting out that key term. If there's a procedure of making arguments or of undertaking a certain set of processes that you adopt from one of your sources, then you're using the source as a kind of method or methodology. In fact, in Bissup's own article, I couldn't find an example of method except to say that he did borrow, for example, the key terms primary and secondary research, which are the integral terms to the method of undertaking research against which he's arguing. So he does use some key terms. He didn't really use procedures, models, or perspectives consistently across the work that he was doing. Finally, Bissup leaves us with a rule of thumb. If you start with an exhibit or something that you analyze, look for argument sources to engage. If you start with argument sources, look for exhibits to interpret. Now that statement takes a little bit of mulling over a little bit to get its full impact. So I encourage you to think for a few minutes about the implications of that particular statement and to see whether it's meaningful for you and how it might be meaningful for you. Bissup also makes several parting comments that I'd like to leave you with as well. He writes, "The best academic papers are those that analyze specific exhibits in order to further conversations." Analyze exhibits to further the conversations. He also notes that those who start from exhibits often risk producing papers driven by the complexity thesis, and by this he means that the thesis is something like, this issue is so complex, we need to examine it because of its complexity, and then the exhibits are instances A, B, C, D of that complexity. And this is a risk, he says, that you might take, so try to avoid that or consider that as a possibility that you want to try to mitigate as you write. He also notes that students who start from argument sources as part of their own argument risk producing papers that merely rehash what others have already said. So if you're simply joining a conversation and telling your readers what everyone else has said, you really haven't made your contribution yet to that conversation. So please keep that in mind as well. Students who develop writing projects from background sources, he says, run the risk of writing mere vanilla reports. So in other words, if all you're doing is giving us background information, you're not forwarding an argument or really substantively entering into the conversation. So you need to move beyond simply providing background information. Finally, he says, students who begin from method sources begin with procedures. So for example, a procedure or a key term or perspective. And those students risk simply dwelling in the methodology and not applying it. So if there is a procedure that you borrow from one of your primary sources, you want to then take that procedure and apply it to something new. You want to extend that into some exhibits, or to make an argument about it. Thank you for listening.